when Shannon let me know that cane toads was on deck for a film to be shown in this series. I've probably seen this film at least a dozen times, and it's not necessarily that I love frogs. I do love frogs, but they've been a really useful model for a lot of questions that I'm interested in, from ecology and evolution and physiology, and most recently conservation. So I wanted to talk for a few minutes a little bit about this guy and the role of amphibians a little bit in our ecosystems, and especially about invasive species. We've got a lot of globalization going on in the world, and along with that comes some environmental challenges. So I wanted to talk a little bit and use the cane toad as a case study. So I first encountered these toads during my PhD research, which I did down in Panama. This is Panama, and the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute has some really nice research stations, including right here on the Atlantic side. This is a photo, an aerial photo of the little town of Gamboa. And I was just telling Philip here where some of my research took place. I would don my rubber boots, don my headlamp, and head down the road to my field site every night and listen to a cacophony of over 15 different frog species that we're calling, including Bufo marinus, the cane toad, or also known as the giant toad or the marine toad. It's got lots of names. And also in graduate school, I was lucky enough to work with a true expert in amphibian behavior and ecology, Kent Wells. He literally just wrote the book on amphibians. And he showed cane toads, the movie that we're about to watch, in a couple of my courses. So it was really interesting to first view that film. And then also, I've worked it into my curriculum, of course. I teach biodiversity at Colby College, and so the cane toad serves very well as, again, a case study in invasive species. So as an invasive species, or any invasive species that we think about, any pest species that we might think about, we think about using pesticides, or an alternative right now is to use a biological control. I found a definition: the deliberate use of naturally occurring organisms to limit the distribution and abundance of a target species. That target species tends to be a pest. Purple loosestrife is a beautiful flower, yes, but it's also an invasive species. It takes over wetlands. It's from Europe. It's invaded North America, as you can see, and it really causes problems. It chokes out everything, and it's very hard to get rid of. If you pull it up, you're going to leave some root material behind, and it'll still grow. Seeds are very widespread. You can chop it off, and it'll still grow. So right now, a solution, I think in over half the states in the United States, is to use biological control, and these are European beetles that control the population of purple loosestrife in Europe. They are very host-specific for purple loosestrife and do a number on them. There are 4 beetles. There's one that likes to eat the leaves. There's one that likes to eat further down on the stem, and the larvae also like to eat the leaves. And there are 2 of these species, and then we've got a larva that loves to eat down at the roots. And so eventually they will eat out the purple loosestrife, eat that population. They should not switch hosts, so presumably they won't jump hosts. You're shaking your head. Maybe they have, I don't know. But we have introduced these. So far I don't know of any calamities, but hopefully once the host species dies out, so does the biological control. We have a problem with sugarcane beetles devastating sugarcane crops. This is, I think, a New World species, and then we've got our Old World species that was problematic in the sugarcane fields in Australia, and that's where our cane toad comes in. So as a biological control, scientists thought, and the farmers thought, wow, if we introduce this toad, it eats all kinds of insects, so it'll probably eat this sugarcane beetle sometime in its life cycle. So they hatch out as a grub and eventually metamorphose into a winged adult. So here we have a map of the range of the cane toad. I've added a new genus that they've substituted for the old genus, Rhinella. If you know anything about systematics and taxonomy, it's ever-changing. Whoever comes up with a more historic name wins. So here's Bufo marinus. We have the native range in northern South America through Central America and even up into parts of Texas. And the first introductions to control sugarcane beetles were made to Puerto Rico. And then from Puerto Rico, they decided to move them on to Hawaii. And then from Hawaii, they moved them on to Queensland, Australia. So that's where our movie is going to pick up. You'll get a little bit of the history here. But I think it's interesting to just see this progression, and you can see that the introduced ranges are there in red. We have them now in Florida. They were introduced for the same reason. Several introductions between 36 and 64. A couple introductions in Louisiana. And here we have Hawaii, Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, and even Guam. I didn't get a date for those, but you can see that they're fairly widespread now in sort of the Caribbean regions. A little bit about the ecology of the toad, and like most toads, we have males and females. We have males that will call, and you'll hear plenty of this on the tape, but I thought I'd at least introduce you to what these toads sound like. That's about as loud as I can get it here, I think. And this is in a tropical area in Mexico, and the males, for most frog species, it's just the male that produces a call. He's competing with other males around for attention of the female. The female eventually will come into the chorus. She'll choose her male. They'll go into a position we call amplexus, and the females are producing eggs and extruding them from what we call a cloaca, and that's the common opening for both gametes and waste products. And at the same time, the male is extruding sperm from his cloaca. So you can see in this position, they're able to put out their gametes just together. Females are producing these very long strings, very dense strings of eggs. And so they're all about in the water. The tadpoles hatch out of those eggs quite quickly. They grow legs quite quickly, and then they'll metamorphose into the legged adult, or the legged juvenile phase, and then they'll slowly, over the number of years, get to be the sizes that you'll see in the movie tonight. And this is a pretty typical breeding area. They're not necessarily a forest species, but they like these clearings, and they like flooded ditches, and just about anywhere they can put their eggs, which again will quickly hatch. A couple interesting tidbits about cane toads. Once you have an invasive species, it's in an environment, it's going to adapt. It can potentially evolve. The chytrid fungus that Serena talked about has been a pathogen. It's been destroying a lot of frog populations around the world, and it's adapting. You find different ways that it's growing in every different place. And so these invasive species just do a really good job of surviving. So in Australia, the cane toad was introduced in the 1930s, and at that point, they were moving pretty slowly from Queensland into the interior, and you can see until about the 1960s, they were going at a pretty slow rate. Currently, they move at about 40 to 60 kilometers a year, which is a lot. So they're spreading. They've been spreading. They're problematic in Australia, you'll see. And again, why they're undergoing natural selection. Those individuals that are getting to the good environments first are doing well, they're breeding well, their genes are being passed on to the next generation. And here we have sort of a display of change in these populations. We've got, in general, some long established populations, and then as they move into a new area, we've got these early invaders, and these current invaders are moving much more quickly. At the front of their invasion, as they move into new areas, these toads are bigger, and the bigger toads are moving faster. They actually have longer legs compared to their bodies, and these longer legged toads are moving more quickly. They're amazingly active, so they move every night and they can move several kilometers a day, and they're very directional. They don't move randomly. The old ones, the ones that didn't make it, are actually moving pretty randomly, but the current leaders of this invasive front are actually moving very directionally, so that helps them move quickly. The other interesting tidbit is that as the toads are moving into new areas, they're also causing those species, the native species, to evolve to deal with them. Toads are very toxic. They've got these parotid glands. There are some neat demonstrations of the poison coming out of these parotid glands. They can kill most things that try to eat it. So again, we've got a very successful invader. It breeds well. Nothing wants to eat it or kill it. So if you're perhaps a potential toad predator, you need to be toad smart. You need to be active at night. Toads are not necessarily moving around. They're pretty stationary at night. And perhaps eat smaller toads, which will contain less toxin. So we've got a couple of species that have been able to do this. This red-bellied black snake, actually the more recent populations have smaller heads. So they only eat the small toads, so they don't die. So they're toad smart. So, and Rick Shine at the University of Australia has done quite a bit of work. He's found that snakes in toad-infested areas don't eat toads. Snakes that are coming from areas without toads actually do try to eat them, and they die. Toad-smart snakes can tolerate the toad's poison, but only the poison from small toads. And again, these toad-smart snakes have smaller heads to limit what kind of toads that they ingest. So I think that's pretty interesting. So we'll get into the movie. I'm happy to answer questions beforehand. I'm also going to stick around afterwards. So if you have questions, any questions on frogs or any amphibians, but you'll see that this is a very problematic, very challenging species. So what's next? There actually was a sequel to the movie. It's not nearly as good as this one. So we do have Cane Toads: The Conquest. As you can see, here's the original introduction. And you can see in 2008 they had moved here. And all of this potential habitat is where the cane toads could be moving into. And again, Rick Shine has done quite a bit of good work. I've pulled some of the information from this canetoadsinOz.com website. So feel free to track the toads yourselves. And I did want to give a shout out to our own introduced species. This is the mud puppy, and it's the one amphibian that has made it into Maine with an accidental, I guess, introduction into Great Pond in 1939, and that wasn't bad enough, but he did it again in 1940. A Colby College professor was keeping them in a little pen in an outlet in Great Pond, but now you can see Maine has its own little population of mud puppies, and it's a salamander that's completely aquatic, but you know, as far as we know, it's pretty benign, but some fishermen think that they compete with the local fish. So I just wanted to show our own little invasion here. So otherwise, enjoy the show. Yeah.
What's the current status in Australia of the cane toads? Have they found any way to control them at all, or?
Not that I know of. They're working on it.
Working on it? For how many years have they been working on it now?
It's 1932.
But that movie, it's a little out of date, so
Yeah.
I'm wondering what's happened since the movie. You know, how far have they come? How far south?
I had a slide up, and it's if you go to canetoadsinOz.com, there's a lot of good information. So they've gone well beyond that delimitation that they show on the map in the movie, and there's even more potential habitat. So they'll, like the rabbits in Australia, they'll just keep moving into areas. And again, they're adapting, so they're doing better in drier climates, so they can get into the outback, and it's bad. The one thing I did find is that they're trying to train some of the native mammals not to eat the cane toads. And so if you make them aware, if you can use conditioning and teach some of these small mammals not to eat them, they might survive. So that's
Well, they're not the only invasive species, though, in
No.
Australia.
no.
There were some others there, too, because I was just down in Melbourne here
Uh-huh.
for a while in February.
I think Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, they've all had their share of introduced and invasive species. So.
But you know, while I was watching that film, it was a great film because it's funny, and it gives you some science at the same time. You know, it kind of blends a little humor there with science. But then I wondered about global, climate change. And isn't that going to change the habitat of some of these animals and, frogs and whatever?
Sure. And it's hard to predict what might happen again. As the environments are changing, those individuals that can survive in the changed environments are going to pass their genes on, so they'll adapt and or not. It's really hard to predict, I would say.
Can they survive in cooler climates? I thought there was a slide with Alaska up there or something. Is it?
Oh, that's just an inclusive slide from the USGS. Yeah,
okay.
yeah. No, they couldn't survive in Alaska. The only wood frogs, our heroes of the north, are the only amphibian that gets above the Arctic Circle. So, and just barely.
You mentioned in one of your slides that they were introduced into Louisiana.
Yeah.
Have they become a pest there, or are there more natural predators? Or?
I don't know. I don't know too much about the population there. Or, in Florida, I think it's just a small enough population. Maybe they're just being kept at the margins. They're also affected by pesticides, natural pesticides being used in crops.
So how are they controlled in Texas, though, in their natural habitat?
I don't know enough about that range. It's probably just, again, marginal enough, just far enough north that perhaps the climate is cool enough and perhaps dry enough to keep them at bay.
Well, I mean, the natural predators that are in South America and stuff, do you know anything that naturally controls them?
Boy, that's a good question.
Because that would explain how they could live in Louisiana. Possibly.
Yeah, there's probably some snakes that can deal with the toxin. We've got a lot of animals that have that ability to metabolize the toxin. So.
I just wondered if you would talk about chytrid fungus, because I'm also interested, I don't know what the most recent, how far it's spread. It's been in the west, right, of the United States. But I wondered if you'd just talk about that a tiny bit, just because it's...
Yeah, it's global. It's here in Maine.
Okay,
There was a graduate student who did a metapopulation analysis on green frogs in New England, and so Philip, I don't know if you swabbed as many green frogs as you could and sent these off, but she was really trying to get a handle on how widespread it was. So I tested frogs in 5 different areas in the Waterville area, and they all tested positive.
Really? Wow.
But it's hard to tell. Again, it's a really interesting pathogen because some frogs are protected by these skin secretions. The antimicrobial properties, just like an antibiotic, keeps the fungal growth at bay, so the frogs don't die. Other frogs do succumb immediately to the fungus. It gets into the skin, and we think it disrupts the ability of the skin to regulate water and electrolytes and everything that very thin frog skin does. Most recently, the microbiome, or the whole bacterial community on the skin of frogs, has become really sort of at the forefront of the research, because these bacteria are producing compounds that tend to inhibit the growth. That's what I've been doing all spring. I'm growing 3 different strains of chytrid fungus, and I'm testing it against secretions from 4 frogs from Maine and from 1 frog in Brazil from secretions, and lots of metabolites from the bacteria that are growing on the skin of frogs. So you grow up the bacteria and you drain off the cells and keep what the bacteria are actually producing, and that tends to inhibit the growth too. So it's kind of all over the board. And then, as I mentioned, the fungus itself, wherever it's growing, has a slightly different form. The chytrid fungus in Maine tends to grow in big clumps, and they don't produce the spores as readily. The strain from Panama and the strain from Brazil just push out spores like crazy. So you can imagine they're just infecting the frogs at different rates and in different ways. So it's all over. Australia is a big problem with chytrid fungus, and it's killed off several populations. I'm not sure if the cane toad is susceptible, but that could be a potential. I imagine with all the stuff that they're secreting on their skin, and they're also much more terrestrial, and this is an aquatic fungus. So in the terrestrial realm, they're not going to get as strong an infection. So there's lots of variables in there. It's complex.
I just wondered whatever possessed them to introduce cane toads when, where was the scientific evidence? Didn't they check that out?
No, obviously. No. I'm glad I wasn't on the scientific board back then. No, it's a bad part of
Maybe
history.
somebody stood to make some money or something.
Yeah, I don't know.
That's
I don't
usually
know.
behind something like that.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.